I call Grant Robertson.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I rise, as Trevor Mallard has already noted, to join with the Labor Party in supporting this bill to Select Committee, and it's very important to note that it will be going to the Government Administration Committee, where I look forward to Mr Hayes' normal constructive contribution throughout. As we know, Parliament's all... Minister, what he could have been. He could have applied all of that diplomatic skill and tact to that role as he brings it to the Government Administration Committee week in and week out. Mr Speaker, the Labor Party is supporting this bill through to Select Committee, but as Mr Mallard has said, we want to reserve our position beyond there because there are a number of quite significant and important decisions being taken here that deserve close scrutiny by the committee. And we want to make sure that we do retain the balance between enabling the tournament to take place and be a fantastic advertisement for New Zealand, but also protecting the rights that we already have in law for people to have their say about developments and for developments not to detrimentally affect the environment or the places that we live. And I think, Mr Speaker, one of the main reasons that I personally feel comfortable about supporting this bill to Select Committee is because the other options that we have in front of us for managing the quite large amount of work that's going to need to take place aren't ones that we actually have the ability to now do and be confident that we can hold the Cup and host the Cup in the way that we'd like. If we look at the regulatory impact statement, it gives us those two options. And the first of those listed in the regulatory impact statement is to amend district plans through the RMA to allow the works to take place, the urgent works or the additional activities. And I think it's quite clear for any of us who've had any involvement in the amendment of district plans that that's going to be a slow process. It's not going to be a process that would enable us to actually be confident that we will have all the I's dotted and T's crossed in time for the World Cup itself. That would have been the process that provided the maximum public input into how the Cup will be hosted, but I don't think it could be done in a timely manner. And as Mr Mallard said, perhaps if we were discussing this a year ago, we could be looking more seriously at that option, but actually we can't do that now. The second option listed in the regulatory impact statement would involve amending the Major Events Act in order to do this and effectively do it through an order in council. But actually, the bill makes a pretty good case for the fact that specific legislation is required rather than generic legislation like the Major Events Act. And the examples that Mr Brownlee mentioned in his initial comments around examples from the Commonwealth Games in Victoria or indeed in the UK for the Olympics, I think give us a good guide to the fact that specific legislation is actually very useful in the situation. It means that everybody's clear about what the powers are and how they can be used. So I think this is the option that we need to pursue. It needs to go to a select committee to be analysed and make sure that we know that we have got that balance right. Because on this side of the House, Mr Speaker, we are cautious about going down a path that actually limits people's ability to have their say on developments, resource consents and issues in their community. And we have some reason on this side of the House to be cautious about what the government might do in this regard, because we've seen several examples from them where people's democratic rights at a local authority level have been undermined. And we stood in this House, and a number of us took calls in this House as we watched the people of Canterbury lose their right to even have an election this year. We watched in some sense of horror as an election was cancelled for the people of Canterbury and that their council was taken away from them completely. So I think, Mr Speaker, you'll understand perhaps why we're cautious on this side of the House about a bill that will be limiting people's rights in terms of how they interact with their local authorities. We also obviously have seen it in Auckland. I'm sure my colleague Phil Twyford, when he speaks later in this debate, will speak a bit more about perhaps how in Auckland there's deep concern about the way in which democratic rights have been undermined as the super city's been created. And Franklin and Rodney, that's right, both of those districts very concerned. And I think overall, on this side of the House, we do operate in a very cautious way when it comes to looking at how this government approaches local democracy. And this bill really is actually about local democracy in many ways. It's saying that we want to protect, and on the surface it says we want to protect people's rights in terms of how resource consents are granted, how major events are dealt with, but it also puts in place an infrastructure that will speed things up and if need be, perhaps potentially circumvent that. Now, as Mr Mallard's already stated, the basis of the decision-making for the local authorities will still be the same. But there is now in this bill a number of different processes that will actually move around that and, as I say, potentially circumvent that, and we do need to be extremely cautious about that. I just want to speak briefly about a couple of specific issues within the bill. The establishment in Part 2 of the Rugby World Cup Authority. It's obviously important to have an organisation or have a group that can oversee this. But I am just a little concerned about the relationship between the authority and the Minister for the Rugby World Cup. Because, again, as Mr Mellow's already stated, the authority has a certain set of powers. It's going to have people appointed to it by the Minister in consultation with some other ministers, including, for instance, the Minister for the Environment, which is a good thing. But it does mean at the end of the day the Minister is going to be put in the position of possibly making quite specific decisions about matters to do with resource consents, about the liquor licensing issues and so on. So I think we need to be very cautious of that. And I do note too that the Minister for the Rugby World Cup himself said that he'd be consulting with the Minister for Economic Development. And I just do want to pause for a minute and say in all seriousness that Mr Brownlee fulfilling both of those roles, we do have to be careful about that in this situation. He's the Minister of the Rugby World Cup. He's Associate Minister, isn't he, Mr Brownlee? Associate Minister in McCulley's. Right, so that's obviously the cause of the confusion, is because in fact Jerry's doing all the work. I know. Well, between those two, between Mr McCulley and Mr Brownlee, it's a tough choice, isn't it? So I think we need to be very careful about the accountabilities between those two ministers. And I do also think that I want to pick up Mr Mellow's point about the leverage too. I think as a country, we knew when we got the right to host the Rugby World Cup, it offered a huge opportunity. And it offered a huge opportunity not just for 70,000 people to show up here, travel around the country, enjoy the games. It offered an opportunity to showcase New Zealand. And I remember in the very early days discussions about things like a New Zealand film festival that would tour the country where the major teams were playing. A touring New Zealand music festival that would also tour the country where the major games would be playing. And I don't get a sense that we're hearing those kind of innovative ideas coming out of the government now. The leverage is where New Zealand can really benefit from this. And as Mr Mallard says, well, that's right, because otherwise it will not deliver the benefits that everyone hoped for. So I hope we're going to hear more about that. I know that there are people beavering away in the Ministry of Economic Development on these ideas, but I'm not sure how far that's reached out to other parts of the New Zealand sector, the creative sector, or indeed other parts of the economy. So it would be good to see a greater amount of leverage, a greater focus on the leverage that the World Cup could give us, and I do hope that Ministers McCulley and Brownlee will actually be able to deal with that. But it's important to have a bill like this because issues are going to arise as we prepare for the World Cup that we haven't foreseen. And right now in Auckland, the staff of the Rendezvous Hotel in Auckland have been locked out. It's a 4.5-star hotel there, people on the minimum wage. And I'd like to see, obviously, I think many colleagues would like to see a lockout like that end quickly, but we're going to see more things like this. People are putting up tariffs for the hotels up to exorbitant rates. I don't think we're seeing much in the way of wage increases commensurate with the increased charges that are going to be coming through there. Now, obviously, this bill doesn't deal specifically with those sorts of matters, but what it does highlight, Mr Speaker, is that urgent matters will arise, difficulties will arise, and we do need a mechanism to be able to deal with that. But what we shouldn't do is throw out the processes that are good for New Zealand in terms of allowing people to have their say and protecting the environment. When this bill comes out of Select Committee, I hope it'll provide a balanced approach that allows us to host a brilliant Rugby World Cup but continues to allow New Zealanders to have their say.